Some years ago, my wife and I were driving south of Madrid, and suddenly we came upon, well, this. This very painting, and instinctively we both yelled, "Oh, Callner!" All of the exaggerations and the abstractions of the painting made that place, made that moment even more real, as art often does.
Welcome to The Object Itself, a podcast brought to you by the Albany Institute of History and Art. In each episode, we invite a guest to select one object from our collection or from an exhibition, an object that speaks to them in a unique way. With over 35,000 works in the Albany Institute's permanent collection and over 1 million items in special collections, each piece holds a story, a link to our past, a message for the future. What stories emerge when we devote our full attention to a single object? What contemporary resonances can be found within a 19th century landscape painting, a cast iron stove, a bed frame with feet carved in the shape of dolphins, a painted plaster figurine of Nipper, the RCA Victor dog? In this podcast, we'll delve into the rich histories and personal reflections that our guests bring to the table, revealing how these objects continue to inspire and connect us across time. Whether it's a Hudson River School painting, an antique chair, or an object from everyday life, we'll explore why it matters and what it tells us about our world, past and present. Join us as we take the time to look closer and appreciate the object itself. My guest today is Serdar Arat. He's a visual artist of Turkish origins, living and working in New York since 1980 with nearly 40 one-person and 60 group exhibitions, primarily in New York City and Istanbul. Many reviews and articles about Serdar's work include half a dozen in the New York Times, a monograph by Bill Arning, a documentary film by Ken Calhoun, among others. He's a recipient of the Pollock-Krasner Foundation grant, and his works are in many private and public collections. Serdar was a former student of the late artist Richard Callner, and Serdar has selected a work by Callner to discuss on today's episode. So I first wanted to begin this episode. Could you go ahead and describe this piece for the listeners?
I think what pops up first is yellows and oranges and reds and greens and blues, all these bright colors that coalesce into a landscape, which is seemingly receding into the distance, much like Van Gogh's landscapes, actually. It's bright, colorful, and highly patterned. So that's a general description of the landscape. The landscape, it looks like, nature is actually ornamenting itself, because these brightly colored areas, which are supposed to be fields east of Madrid, they look like pieces of fabric with various patterns, and then you go into the distance to these really red, glowing, red and burgundy and brown hills, and you realize they're sort of dotted with these, what are supposed to be olive trees, which are though perfectly round in shape, and in fact each one has a highlight, somewhat translucent, so they really look like glass beads or pearls, actually. So truly, nature is, in a very fun way, ornamenting itself, putting on fabrics and jewelry, just like people do. I selected this painting because some years ago, my wife and I were driving south of Madrid, and suddenly we came upon, well, this. This very painting, and instinctively we both yelled, "Oh, Callner!"
Amazing, like this vista.
Right. You wouldn't expect it, because when you look at the painting, which by the way is a watercolor on paper, watercolor and gouache, It looks fairly exaggerated and abstracted, so you wouldn't expect to recognize this place when you see it in real life. But in a funny way, the all of the exaggerations and the abstractions of the painting made that place, made that moment even more real, as art often does. So that would be the general description for listeners of this painting.
Absolutely. And you alluded to this a little bit with the reference to Van Gogh, but maybe you could talk a little bit too about some of Callner's influences. I mean, you described so
Right.
beautifully, basically, European modernism and Eastern sensibilities, daily life and ancient myths, and recognizable images and wild abstractions to create a uniquely authentic vision. Talk about that more.
One of the truly amazing things in Richard Callner's work, for me, is that he seems to hold extremely diverse sensibilities all together in one work, which is so hard to do. So he is certainly influenced, and as a young man, by the way, he studied in Paris with Fernand Léger and met many of the other artists. This is in the late 40s and early 50s. So he was certainly influenced by European modernism, and you can immediately see all different shades of European modernism in his work. But at the same time, his interest in and his closeness through his family. His wife is a Japanese American, and he traveled in Japan and to the east. Uh, Various Eastern sensibilities are very much influencing his work. So we said European modernism. Van Gogh, for instance. When we look at this landscape, we see, in his words, a landscape that's receding into deep space, seemingly with its own energy. Now, that's something that's singularly etched into our memory by Van Gogh. And it's acknowledged by Callner as such. He said that is actually a gift from Van Gogh, that receding into deep space very dynamically and energetically. And for some reason, deep space in art tends to evoke deep yearning. And we feel that in Van Gogh's work and in many of Callner's works as well. So, at the same time, when we look at examples of Japanese art, for instance, and design, like some of the classical kimono fabric designs, we are struck by a sense of flatness first, but flatness that comes from putting equal emphasis on everything in the work. So whether these are images of birds or figures of trees or flowers or simply background objects or clouds, or whether they're supposed to be in the foreground or background doesn't seem to make any difference. Everything in that universe of the Japanese slash Eastern sensibility is treated with the same importance, same intensity of color, same deliberation of drawing or forming. And there are other qualities, of course. Light, for instance, seems to emanate through these images rather than being a directional light casting a shadow to one side, the way we would encounter it in Western art, for instance. And certainly there's no real hierarchical importance of objects. So all of that creates an equality of all things in the Japanese or Eastern universe, which ends up with a kind of shallow space, but also a resonance of all things with the same kind of energy. So that said, there are of course many other influences that we can talk about. Islamic art, Islamic sensibility, again, generally being a part of what's called Eastern sensibility, is very much at play here. uh, patterns and ornamentation and endless variation of geometric patterns or organic what are called arabesques. We see that repeatedly in Callner's work as well, but it's never sort of direct or one-dimensional. Um, we see opposites held together. Here, for instance, so many different elements. We're looking at the hills that are populated with these olive trees or these beads or pearls, which have their own unique energy, which is right next to the sharp zigzags that we see in the fields and their designs, right next to the very soft patches of tones and colors like the yellows and oranges that sort of resonate from underneath. All of those elements, well, each resonating with its own energy and rhythm, are held together. They coexist. So this, in a way, is a harmony of extreme diversities that are held together very beautifully.
That's so fascinating hearing you describe, especially the references to the Japanese techniques of everything is
Right.
treated with the same level of specificity and focus. And it's making me appreciate this landscape even more because if you're not using atmospheric perspective, if you're not getting
Right.
colder in the distance, if you're
Mm,
not getting
right.
fuzzier in the distance, how do you show this really, really
Mm,
deep space?
that's right. Here, of course, as you said very well, this atmospheric
Mm.
perspective, colors and details fading as you supposedly go into the distance, that doesn't exist. But there's a very strong sense of being pulled into that distance. I, that what's called the vanishing point. The work also offers the very opposite of what it starts out with. So, in one instance, you're seeing this strong pull into the distance. But if you go to that distance and spend a moment or two there on the horizon light, most probably that point is going to begin to come forward and sort of reverse itself. Of course, he does that beautifully with interiors more than the landscapes, but landscapes also have that quality. They can, in an instant, the perspective can reverse itself, or the feeling of, depth and so forth can reverse themselves. One of his favorite artists, all-time favorite artists, is Gustav Klimt. And if we can imagine, picture Klimt's works, they are, whether they're figures or landscapes, they also have this pattern-like arrangement, various body parts. You can have multiple figures where you will begin to put together like a puzzle almost of, what body part belongs to whom in the painting. And everything will be enveloped in a sort of resonance of patterns and colors. So we see that very clearly in Callner's work as well, and a sense of flatness of design, but also a sense of suspension in space, like these places and figures and objects are defying gravity. So Klimt is a good example, although in his figures, which doesn't relate exactly to this painting, but in his figures, there's a kind of raw sexuality, the raw energies of life. In Callner's work, the raw sexuality of Klimt, or the raw powers of life, are translated into a more spiritual sensuality. Both Callner and Klimt repeatedly invite us to rely upon our senses. For them, that's the only way to get to the truth of their work. In other words, mere intellectual interpretation, that's not going to cut it.
And you referenced this a bit too with so the painting you've selected is a landscape, of course. Another major component of Callner's practice were his interiors. How does this work that we're looking at, Red Fields, east of Madrid, how does this situate within his broader practice?
Right. In the long-term view of his creative process and how his work developed through various stages. This is sort of a late work. So early on, his colors were certainly very rich, but also very somber and muted. And then at one point, the color really explodes along with all the other elements, patterns and shapes and all of that. So that's one thing that changes over time. Another is that he started with, well, certainly the human figure in interiors mostly, and then that human figure became symbolic. He picked some mythological symbols like Lilith, his favorite, and then Artemis and Leda and Lisa and so forth. And those symbolic images or mythological images were kind of interchangeable, and they were hybrids. So that fluidity, interchangeability was all in the service of his personal mythology, of course. So, and at another sort of like a midpoint in his career, I think those symbolic images begin dissolving into just ordinary daily images, like interiors or objects in these interiors, carpets and tapestries and pots and vases, and then landscapes like this one, hills and fields and running waters and trees and so forth. So from symbolic imagery to the everyday imagery, and then towards the end of his life, the late career, those ordinary images begin to dissolve into abstractions. And we end up with a sheer visual experience. In other words, the essence of what we started with. So that I find really beautiful. It's like a metaphor for the creative process for art and also for life, I think. I was reading, I'm also interested in the late career, late styles of artists. So I was reading some material where Anthony Storr, who wrote about these issues, these concerns, was making the observation that for many artists, musicians, writers, what happens is that in early career, maybe early life for any one of us, there's more of an interest to face the world, to make connections, to have empathy and interest in individuals, and to begin to converse with them, so to speak, through art. In late career, that changes into a kind of conversation with oneself, because there's more of an interest in the abstractions, the patterns of life, rather than connecting to individual entities. You're really beginning to, almost like taking a step back, I guess, with the life experience and noticing the repeating patterns of life and that's more abstract. So that's the kind of thing that I see in Callner's work, and these landscapes are situated coming right after the the interiors and the objects in those interiors, and then in some of the later ones we begin to see landscapes through these windows in his interiors, and then we're fully outside in the landscapes where uh, everything is soulfully resonating, seemingly with the same kind of life force or same energy.
Absolutely. You know, we can't have this episode without your personal anecdotes. Of course, you were a student of Callner's, you're an artist yourself. I would love to hear you speak about his influence on your own practice, if there
Right.
is one, and maybe describe your practice a little bit too.
Sure. Well, thank you for that question as well. I was a student of this at the MFA program right here in Albany, SUNY Albany, for 2 years. And his is the kind of work that sort of gets under your skin before you can become aware of it or become conscious of it. I would see his work at his home, his studio, a few places in the office, etc. And pretty soon I was making, works that were very abstract. There were these female figures that also looked like clouds that were floating across landscapes.
Paintings?
Paintings, drawings, mostly drawings and prints. Also, very similar to his actual tapestries that he, produced, or illusion of tapestry-like forms in his paintings. I was actually making very large paintings, very much physically speaking, literally speaking, like tapestries. They were oil and canvas, but they were not stretched. So they'd be suspended from this wooden hanger-like piece at the top, and the edges were trimmed and glued down. So as you walked in front of them, they would actually wave a little bit with the wind. So these are no, things that speak to the power of his work, that before you can even think about it, it's in your work. So it was very influential that way. And he seemed to have understood and was totally comfortable with what I described as some of the Eastern influences and Islamic paintings, for instance. Whereas, I'm coming from Turkey, a predominantly Muslim culture, and for me, all of that, the Islamic art, which I grew up with and lived with, was not that interesting. I wanted Western art. So coming to New York, I sort of left all of those interests behind, and I was kind of surprised to see all of that sort of re-emerging in his work. So those are some of the influences that I'm aware of, and I'm sure there are many others that I'm not aware of. He had a mind that could organize things and formulate things for you and for himself. In fact, producing those tapestries that are very large tapestries, they're about 7 feet tall by 4 or 5 feet across. You have to formulate every square inch of yarn, of wool threads, what color or tone they're exactly going to be, and then put them onto a sheet of paper so you can turn them over to the weavers, the women who are, weaving these things.
Right.
It was a workshop in Israel back in the 60s and 70s where he worked. So that's a different kind of mindset, to have that kind of organizational skill and planning and all of that. For instance, in one of his presentations, one of his slide presentations, he showed us images of the Ghent altarpiece by Van Eyck brothers. And he said that seeing that painting in life was a technical turning point in his oil painting. So a couple of days after that, he was in my studio here at SUNY, and I just very casually happened to mention that I was so impressed with those, pearls that Van Eyck painted. And oh my God, his eyes lit up, and he said, "I have the formula. You want it?" No, I didn't want the formula, but that didn't make any difference. He just, so excitedly grabbed my sketchbook and jotted down some other formulas anyway. One that I have is how to mix your own black. So when you apply it on top of another color, it doesn't crack. But, you look at the page of his, notes, his formulas, and there are all these numbers and percentages, which to this day, I can't make any
Can't
sense.
crack the formula.
Right.
In closing, I would love for you to talk about, this podcast is called The Object Itself, dedicating at least 20 or so minutes to one work of art. Could you say, just in your own words, like what's the importance of spending time with art?
Oh, that's the biggest of questions that you saved to the end. I think experiencing art, and as you said, specifically spending time with it, sort of reverses the daily dynamic of what we do with our time. We're so conscious of getting to the bottom of issues and solving problems and survival and success and all of that, especially today with incredible uninvited distractions of digital media and our devices and so forth. That being in a place like a museum or a gallery or an artist studio where the distractions of life are sort of in the background, perhaps, museums are sometimes chapel-like places, right? Where you can really feel the silence and the distance from daily life and worries, where you're invited to actually slow down and just let your guard down. I think that's the most important and the most difficult part, so that the work in front of you, whatever it is, a painting, sculpture, whatever it might be, can do what it's supposed to do. If we can come to a work of art and just spend a few minutes there, letting the work sort of wash over us and do its thing, so we can begin to feel, oh, so this is what the work is doing to me, or this is what I think or feel about it. In other words, our sincere, honest gut response to the work, before we read about it or think about it or discuss it or listen to a lecture about it and all of that. So actually, the only advice or sometimes requirement I would give to my students or some of the groups that I would send to museums or galleries was just that. Do not read
the labels, the wall text.
Exactly. Yeah. Skip those. Go unprepared and just, if you can, stand in front of a work for just, a few minutes and let it do its thing. Believe me, it's safe, but let it wash over you so you can figure out your experience with the work. And then, once you begin to realize what that relationship is, what your experience is, then, certainly, read about it, talk about it, discuss it. But it's extremely important to figure out our personal response with a work of art, because that's really the purpose of art. It really doesn't matter that much, if at all, what the artist himself or herself intended, because it's not really a message, it's an experience. An artist, sure, tries to control the artwork, as much as he or she can to make it just so. But that's half the job. That's 50% of it. The other 50% is a person who comes up to it and hopefully engages with it. So what we call art, well, at least for me, with a capital A, is not the artwork or the image. Those are just either images or objects, things. The art happens in between that artwork and a person. So whatever goes back and forth between the two, which is an experience, that I believe is art. That's why with the same artwork, you can have one experience, I can have a different experience, and that's how it goes. So to say, oh, well, I don't know much about this artist, or I'm not really an art person, I don't understand this, makes no sense to me. Because art is not made to be understood or learned about or interpreted, intellectually. It's a purely, yes, intellectual, of course, partly, but it's a purely experiential relationship. Emotionally, instinctively, we respond to it, and then see what it does to us.
That's amazing. I feel like if you could just give that as a preamble for everyone visiting the museum before they go into the galleries, people would feel freer. Well, thank you so much, Serdar. This has been a real pleasure.
Thank you. It's been my pleasure.
You can check out Richard Callner's work on the Albany Institute's website by browsing the online collections database. We also have a book available in our museum shop. It's a past exhibition catalog of a solo show of Callner's work here at the Institute. To look at the work of Serdar Arat and to see when he has upcoming lectures and events, visit serdararat.com. And thanks so much for tuning in to today's episode of The Object Itself.